The Amritsar Massacre cover-up. On April 13, 1919, General Reginald Dyer marched 90 troops into Jallianwala Bagh, a walled garden in Amritsar, where thousands of unarmed civilians had gathered for the Baisakhi festival. He blocked the exits, gave no warning, and ordered his men to fire. They discharged approximately 1,650 rounds in 10 minutes. The British government's official death toll was 379. The Indian National Congress counted over 1,000. The Hunter Commission inquiry that followed was designed not to find the truth, but to manage it, ultimately clearing Dyer of criminal wrongdoing while privately admitting the action was excessive. Dyer himself testified it had been a merciful act. Papers from Punjab Lieutenant Governor Michael O'Dwyer, who had authorized the brutal martial law climate that preceded the massacre, were buried. Dyer died in retirement. O'Dwyer was eventually shot dead in London in 1940 by a survivor, the Bengal famine. In 1943, somewhere between 2 and 3 million people starved to death in Bengal, while grain continued to be exported from the region to support the British war effort. Winston Churchill's war cabinet rejected requests for emergency food shipments and redirected Australian wheat away from India. Internal cabinet minutes, declassified over the following decades, showed officials were aware of mass death and continued anyway. Churchill's private contempt for Indians was documented in memos that remained classified long after the war ended. The official British position blamed drought, wartime disruption, and local hoarding. Madhusri Mukherjee's 2010 research into declassified war cabinet files made it significantly harder to sustain that version. The Bengali dead had no monument in London. The policy architects received no censure. The Boer concentration camps. During the Second Boer War, British forces under Lord Kitchener burned Boer farms across South Africa and interned the women and children left behind in concentration camps, where rations were deliberately kept inadequate. At least 26,000 Boer civilians died. Tens of thousands of black Africans were held in entirely separate camps, with worse conditions and far less systematic record-keeping, and their death toll is estimated at over 20,000, though the records are incomplete by design. When activist Emily Hobhouse returned from South Africa with photographs and testimony documenting the camp conditions, her report was suppressed. She was physically prevented from re-entering the country at Cape Town Harbor. The government's response was to dispatch the Fawcett Commission, not to investigate the abuses, but to undermine Hobhouse's findings. It largely succeeded. The Mau Ais Mau detention camps. Between 1952 and 1960, British colonial forces in Kenya detained somewhere between 80,000 and 320,000 Kikuyu people. The figures remain disputed, in a network of camps known as the Pipeline. What had happened inside those camps included castration, rape, and prolonged beatings. On March 3, 1959, 11 detainees were beaten to death by warders at Hola Camp. The initial cover story was that they had died drinking contaminated water. Internal telegrams contradict this within hours of the killings. Enoch Powell, not known for progressive politics, stood in Parliament on June 27, 1959, and condemned the cover-up directly. No warder or officer was ever convicted. As Kenyan independence approached in 1963, British officials initiated Operation Legacy, shredding or shipping crates of incriminating colonial files back to the UK. The existence of a hidden archive at Hanslope Park only became known in 2011. In 2013, the British government paid £19.9 million in compensation to survivors, its first formal acknowledgement of what had happened, the Batang Kali massacre. On December 12, 1948, British soldiers from the Scots Guards entered the village of Batang Kali in Malaya and shot dead 24 unarmed Chinese rubber tappers. The official account was that the men had been killed while attempting to escape. Veterans later gave testimony suggesting they had been ordered to kill the men regardless. Scotland Yard opened investigations in 1970 and again in 2008. Both were shut down. The UK government argued in 2011 before the Supreme Court that no inquest was necessary, and the court agreed. Documents relating to the massacre were among the files managed or withheld outside normal declassification schedules. The families of the dead spent more than 6 decades seeking an official acknowledgement that never fully came. The village itself was burned to the ground after the killings, the Cyprus torture campaigns. During the Cyprus emergency of 1955 to 1959, British security forces detained Greek Cypriot suspects in interrogation centers where electric shocks, mock executions, and sustained beatings were documented in internal reports. Governor John Harding signed emergency detention laws while publicly denying any ill treatment was occurring. Files from the Cyprus colonial administration were among those destroyed or removed in Operation Legacy, with destruction confirmed as occurring in both 1956 and 1959 as British control wound down. A 2014 European Court of Human Rights ruling in the interstate case Cyprus versus UK confirmed systematic abuse had taken place, though by that point the evidential record had been significantly thinned. The interrogation methods refined in Cyprus would later be exported, step by step, to other corners of the empire, the Aden torture scandal. At the Fort Mourbout Interrogation Center in British Aden, now Yemen, detainees in the 1963 to 1967 insurgency period were subjected to a specific set of techniques: prolonged wall standing, hooding, continuous loud noise, sleep deprivation, and a reduced diet. An official inquiry, the Bowen Report, was submitted in November 1966 and found considerable ill treatment. Its recommendations were buried. The Ministry of Defense denied systematic abuse in Parliament. What makes Aden particularly significant is what happened next. The same 5 techniques were transferred almost wholesale to Northern Ireland in 1971 for use against Irish detainees. The direct documentary connection between Aden and Belfast was classified for decades and only confirmed through investigative work by RTE and the Gardaí Cruise using declassified files. The European Commission of Human Rights ruled against the UK in 1976 over the Northern Ireland use of the techniques. The Aden origin was never officially acknowledged. The partition of India. In August 1947, Cyril Radcliffe completed the border between India and Pakistan in approximately 36 days, drawing lines through communities, farmland, and water systems he had never visited. The original independence date had been set for June 1948. Lord Mountbatten advanced it by nearly a year. Between 10 and 20 million people were displaced. Estimates of those killed in the communal violence that followed range from 200,000 to 2 million, with no scholarly consensus. Radcliffe burned his papers and working notes immediately after finishing the partition, destroying any record of his reasoning or the alternatives he considered. Internal British correspondence showing awareness that the timeline would produce mass violence was classified for decades. Whether this constitutes a war crime or catastrophic negligence remains debated, but the deliberate destruction of Radcliffe's papers ensures it can never be fully adjudicated. The suppression of the Iraqi revolt. In 1920, British forces crushed a nationwide uprising in Mandatory Iraq using aerial bombing of civilian villages, one of the first deployments of air power against a civilian population in history. Winston Churchill, then colonial secretary, authorized the use of chemical weapons against what he described in internal memos as uncivilized tribes, though whether mustard gas was actually deployed or only authorized remains disputed in the archival record. The RAF officer running air operations in Iraq at the time was Arthur Harris, who would later earn the nickname Bomber Harris for his campaigns over German cities in the Second World War. Casualties were not reported to Parliament. The entire operation was framed as air policing, a cost-cutting measure. Cabinet memos approving collective punishment of civilian settlements were not made available to the public for decades. The Arab Revolt in Palestine. During the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, British forces in Mandatory Palestine carried out systematic collective punishment against Arab civilian communities. In June 1936, the old city of Jaffa was demolished under the cover of urban planning, displacing approximately 6,000 Palestinians in a single operation. Crops were destroyed, homes were blown up in villages suspected of sheltering rebels, and RAF aircraft bombed and strafed rural settlements with civilian casualties routinely underreported in official dispatches sent to London. Declassified British military files, confirmed by reporting in 2017, document the practice of handcuffing Arab detainees to the front of military vehicles as human shields. Official reports consistently describe targets as rebel combatants. Field reports acknowledge the civilian reality. The overall Arab death toll for the revolt exceeded 5,000, the vast majority Palestinian Arabs. The Diego Garcia expulsion. Between 1968 and 1973, the entire indigenous population of the Chagos archipelago, between 1,500 and 2,000 people, was forcibly removed from their homeland so the United States could build a military base on Diego Garcia. The British government described the islanders in internal Foreign Office memos as Man Fridays, a deliberate legal fiction designed to classify a settled indigenous population as transient workers and thereby strip them of rights. Pets and livestock were gassed. Residents received little notice. The existence of the treaty with the United States was concealed from Parliament. A 1966 FCO memo, confirmed in declassified documents, explicitly discussed creating the fiction that the islands had no permanent population. The UK Supreme Court ruled against the right of return in 2008. The International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion in 2019 declaring British administration of the islands unlawful. The Chagosians remain exiled. The Hola Camp Massacre. Hola Camp deserves its own entry because it is the moment the cover-up mechanism was caught in real time. On March 3, 1959, 11 Mau Mau detainees at Hola were beaten to death by colonial warders for refusing to perform forced labor. The Colonial Office's first public statement said the men had died after drinking contaminated water. This was known to be false within hours. The Commissioner of Prisons had already telegraphed the real cause. The cover story held in public long enough to matter. When it collapsed, Enoch Powell stood in the House of Commons and delivered a speech that remains one of the most direct parliamentary condemnations of imperial impunity in British history, arguing that if the same standard were applied at home as abroad, the events at Hola would be treated as murder. No one was prosecuted. The Dirty War in Northern Ireland. Through the 1970s and 1980s, British Army units, including the SAS and the Undercover Force Research Unit, carried out extrajudicial killings of IRA suspects, and in documented cases, civilians, without attempts at arrest. The Stalker Inquiry, launched in 1984 to investigate RUC shoot-to-kill incidents, was shut down when investigator John Stalker was removed from the case in June 1986 under circumstances he later described in his 1988 memoir as politically motivated. The Stevens inquiries, running across 3 phases from 1989 to 2003, documented collusion between British security forces and loyalist paramilitaries who then killed civilians. In 2012, Prime Minister David Cameron formally acknowledged British state collusion in the 1989 murder of solicitor Pat Finucane. Files on agent handling were withheld, destroyed, or ruled outside inquiry scope. The Legacy and Reconciliation Act of 2023 effectively granted immunity from prosecution for Troubles-era offenses, a move legal scholars and victims groups widely described as the final institutional cover-up. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.